We'll have an afternoon of applications talks again today, and in particular we'll have two talks on earth science applications, kicked off by Lindsay on UQ Sciences. Please.
Okay, so my talk today is sort of going to show you what is done, and I'm not advocating it or saying it's wrong. Well, some of it's wrong. But show you what is done, then I'll show you what we've done and how we've learned, and then sort of talk about what I think we need to improve, or actually what we're doing is already too complicated. So just sort of a big overview. This is the climate system. The work I focus on is just this tiny little bit here, yet this is a huge global model. It's complicated to run, and that's just that tiny little bit of it. In sort of the whole climate science community, the main thing is to try and simulate all of this. So what they're doing is just writing computer code that is trying to represent all of this and everything that goes on and all the interactions between it. We simulate for two main reasons, okay, and they're not always well defined on which one you're doing. So we want to understand, so we want to know which is the most important aspect of that climate system. Which one should we focus on? Which one is going to be better to put our money in? There's an awful lot of money goes into these things. And then to predict. So we want to know, like, when will global temperatures reach a certain level, and more importantly, what impact that will have, and how can we try and mitigate against things that might happen. But the important certainties are different for these two settings. And from the work I've done, I'd say we're already overcomplicating what we're doing for this bit. And I can't see how we can improve well enough to do this bit correctly at the minute. So I'll try and explain that in the aerosol setting. Just sort of a very, very vague overview. I don't know how much you know about these sorts of models, but they contain an awful lot of equations. They're hundreds and hundreds of lines of code. They've been written by many different people. Some people have written the same bits of different models. This is the whole independent thing. They're run on sort of these mesh grids. You have horizontal and vertical grids on these, and in each grid you run the code and then you let it pass information. And these things take an awful long time to run. Refining this grid is no simple task at all. When you talk to a climate scientist about uncertainty, they'll probably be in one or two mind settings. They'll either be thinking of a picture similar to this. So this is trying to sort of represent the warming of the climate due to those different components in that figure that I showed earlier. And then these bars are trying to represent their uncertainty in it. Okay, so you've got the greenhouse gases that warms the climate a lot, and there's little uncertainty in that. They know that happens. You have things like aerosols. They don't know really a lot about it at all. So this picture is from, I think, 2001, and this one's from 2005, I think. And these are the same IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you can see that they've not really changed in terms of the uncertainty at all. The models that they're using to make these figures have changed an awful lot. They're representing the science a lot better, but those bars aren't really changing at all. So they're sort of clearly not thinking about the uncertainty as a problem in itself here, and therefore they're not reducing it. If you talk to a different set of climate scientists, they might have this figure in their head. What they're trying to show with this figure, I'm just going to draw it because there's the chalk. What they do is they'll run their climate model, and it will look like this. So this is sort of over time. Okay, those wiggles are the internal variability. Then they'll run a different climate model, and it will look like this, and a different one, and it will look like this. So that's the model uncertainty. So they've run a different model, and they're trying to capture that. And then they say, right, in the future the emissions might change, and they might be really high, and then that will put them up here, or they'll be low, and that will put them up here. And that's what the sort of scenario variability is. But then that looks like they're capturing all the uncertainties, and they're not. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the scenarios later. But that's not even covering all the things that could happen. We can't write a model of every single possible climate system, and we can't write a scenario for everything that might happen over the next 100 years. So they're doing their best, but this is sort of the big figure, the way they do it. If you talk to a statistician, this will be their thoughts of uncertainty. So I've nicked this straight from Michael, so thank you. And this is probably not even exhaustive of Michael's uncertainties. So we're all thinking about completely different uncertainties when we do this, and so bringing that together is really quite difficult. So I'm just going to focus on parametric uncertainty for the rest of the talk. What most climate scientists will be thinking about is this multi-model uncertainty, the diversity between different models. The initial condition uncertainty is just that sort of wiggly line. And then pretty much everything else is not dealt with at all, really. So this is sort of what they're doing. The first thing they do is model versus observations. Whether this is in any way capturing uncertainty is unclear to me. I don't think it really does. All they're doing is making sure their models aren't horribly wrong. But when they do that as well, there are sort of cons to that. Their observations are very sparse. They don't have many of them. They're subject to error. It's not clear how you measure that. And they always sort of compare the model to the best model. So they don't consider any error within their own model when they're comparing to data. So it's always sort of a best model nudged to these observations. To try and sort of, well, I've just put this in really, it's not really relevant because I'm thinking of bigger timescales, but data assimilation is what's made weather forecasting really good, really. But it only works on short timescales, so it's not really relevant for what I'm doing. The multi-model ensembles are the big climate thing. So you might have heard of CMIP. There's CMIP, we're just looking at CMIP 6 now. And that's going to produce a figure similar to that. Okay. The problem with that is that what is causing this sort of diversity between the models is not going to come out of it. And what bits of those scenarios are leading to those jumps is not going to come out of it again. So I still don't think they're going to reduce those error bars from these big multi-model ensembles. They give you some information, but they're not going to be working towards reducing that uncertainty again. Perturbed parameter ensembles are kind of the easiest way to get into this problem because you're looking at one model and you can understand what's going on. So I'll show you how we've sort of learnt quite a lot about the uncertainty from one of these. And stochastic modelling, again, I've just put that in as a token gesture because some people are trying to work on that, but I think in reality we can't really do that. So what they're doing is every parameter they're just perturbing it a little bit and then they rerun. The sort of size of the ensemble you'd need to look at that properly is never going to happen. And also it's probably quite a small uncertainty compared to everything else that we've got. So onto my application now. So this is global aerosol. You can see that it's, just from this picture, that it's in the air, and that must affect the climate. These white bits down here, they're sea spray. That is sort of light, making that ocean lighter, which means that the way the sun interacts with that ocean is going to change. The same up here for dust, and then right at the top, all that white over there, that's sulfate, and that's from pollution. So we are contributing to this by putting that sulfate into the air. And one thing that you can't really see on there is black carbon. So the black carbon gets onto the ice and that darkens the ice. So they have quite big climate effects, possibly. But it's not easy to model these because they're tiny, tiny particles. Imagine the size of a dust particle. Imagine that grid on the global model. How do you go from that to the other? You have to make an awful lot of assumptions. How they interact with the clouds is still scientifically not very well known. And also, compared to carbon dioxide, which you can run for a long time, it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. These only last for months, so sort of how they interact on a long time scale is really difficult to understand. But we're gonna go try anyway. So this is the latest IPCC report. I didn't put this one up earlier, but you might notice that these are still the biggest and they haven't really reduced at all. But the models that we have now are much more complicated. They take much longer to run. They're more well refined. They've got more processes in. But these error bars are still not going anywhere. The important thing about these error bars probably is that this is the warming that we should be induced by CO2. If aerosols are doing nothing, then the climate sensitivity will be lower, okay? If the aerosols have been offsetting a lot of this carbon dioxide warming in the future, then this has huge implications for prediction of climate. So it's really important that we try to get a handle on where this value lies. I tend to think of aerosol effects in two different ways. This is a direct effect. This is an actual aerosol. This is dust. These are dust particles in the air. They'll be affecting the heat content of the ocean underneath. Here we have aerosols, and you can see these little bits here. They're like they're ship tracks. So the ships have changed the properties of those clouds. Okay, so how reflective those clouds are, how long they last, things like that. The aerosols are affecting that here. Okay. We call that the indirect effect. So it's how the clouds and the aerosols interact. This is sort of a very basic view of what they're trying to model. You're trying to put in the correct emissions, get the loss process right, all these sorts of how aerosol bash against each other, the size of them, all of that process trying to be simulated in one of these models. The model I showed earlier was a climate model, but it's sort of exactly the same sort of way of doing it. We have grids, and we have these processes that are just line of codes, and then we run the grids, run that in the grid system. Some of this now I'm just going to go through just to make it hopefully clear what my x's and y's are, and what I'm emulating and what I'm not emulating. So my x here are the model parameters or inputs. In theory, they could be spatial fields or time series, or they could be single values, so a sort of rate that happens that is assumed to happen everywhere, some sort of rate constant, or you might have a rate that you might change over the ocean or the land. But because I like to do things as simply as possible, in this, my x is either going to be one of those parameters that is something such as a rate constant, or it's going to be scaling those spatial temporal fields. Okay, so x for me is always a scalar in any single simulation. Now my x's are uncertain, so my y is uncertain. So I'm going to put an uncertainty distribution G on them. I'm going to get that from the experts. I'm not going to consider capital G. I'm going to sort of let all that sort of work itself out. I'm only going to ask the experts about the marginal uncertainty on each of these x's. So they're only going to give me an uncertainty on a parameter. I'm not going to ask them to consider uncertainty between parameters. So I'm only going to consider these uncertainties marginally. I'm not going to try and jointly elicit anything from an expert. And then obviously I want to obtain some runs of the simulator to try and characterize what happens to y given these uncertainties on x. But f is too complex. 1 month's run in the old model, and what I use for this takes about 90 minutes, I think, just for a single month. In the new more complex model, I think 15 months takes 2 days. So these take an awful long time. So you can't do as many runs as you want to characterize that uncertainty on y. So obviously I'm going to emulate. But we often say an emulator is a replacement for the simulator. And that can sort of really make a scientist go, ooh, you can't replace our simulator, we've put a lot of work into that. And they're right, we're not replacing the simulator, we're taking a single output in some sort of space domain, time domain, and we're emulating just that. Okay? It can't emulate the whole system. Okay, so our emulators are only fit for what output we've put into them. We're not replacing the whole simulator, and we don't try to. So these are only ever going to be complementary to the simulator and for the uncertainty. We still need the simulators, basically. Y can be any output from that simulator. They too can be time series, spatial fields. Again, I'm a quite simplistic kind of person. So you could take the global mean temperature from that simulation. You could take a particular aerosol quantity from a grid box, which is precisely what I've done. So I'm emulating one monthly mean value from one grid box. And then I do it independently through all the grid boxes. And then I see what happens. Okay, the two outputs that I'm going to focus on are something called cloud condensation nuclei. So these are aerosol that are in the atmosphere that have the properties such that water can condense onto them and they can become a cloud droplet. Not all of them will become cloud droplets. There's still an extra process, but some of them will be. They have to be CCN to become a cloud droplet, but not all droplets are CCN. Not all CCN become cloud droplets. And then this aerosol cloud forcing. So this is a concept more than a value. Okay, so this is sort of representing the temperature change due to the aerosol cloud interaction. This can be measured. You can count the number of CCN in the atmosphere. This can't. Okay, and that's an important point as well. But we can build emulators for both of them because they're both model quantities. So just to go through what we did quite quickly, we got a lot of experts involved. We had 4 that actually sat and discussed things, 6 that actually sat and discussed these things, but they sort of asked their aerosol modeler buddies sort of for inputs to it. We gave them a few weeks in advance to tell them what we were going to ask them about, and they said, right, this person's an expert in that, I'll email him and get his thoughts. So it was sort of quite a long process. I'm just doing this now amongst quite a lot of global experts, and we're only doing 3 parameters, and I think we've been at it for about 18 months so far, and we still haven't defined them. So this can be quite a difficult problem, but because we're only using one model here, we have our target output, and we know who to ask. This was relatively simple, even though it's not a trivial thing to do. All I really wanted to know is sort of how they would represent their uncertainties in a PDF. And I did this by asking them sort of it was called the quantile method, so I asked them where their middle value was and then where their 25 and 75% percentile was, and obviously their ranges. And we sort of showed them these plots and said, if it's Gaussian, you're going to put all your uncertainty around the middle. If you've literally got no idea, we're going to put a uniform on it. This is one of the favoured PDFs these days. Basically what this is saying is they're saying, right, I know there's a central range, I'm not sure what it should be between that, but and then it can sort of sharply decline to these ranges, the absolute ranges. So they kind of have a central sort of range and then an absolute range. For the work we did, we have 28 parameters. We decided to include 28 parameters in the end. I've only given the ranges here. Most of them were basically represented using a beta function, and they were tended to be quite skewed actually, except for the scaling values where it was basically just between half and times 2, things like that. So they basically were quite flexible, these PDFs that we put on these, and we checked with them, we made sure that they were happy with it. But we came up with 28 parameters, and then we wanted to design the experiment. So we know that we're going to be targeting the CCN for an output for emulation. We're going to look at 28 parameters. We know the uncertainty on those. Where they're skewed, we can use the log in the design so that we have a good representation with the median of 1 and these scaling factors. So how do we design it? as a lot of people do, I just took the maximum in Latin hypercube. As I spoke to Peter earlier, a lot of people don't like them. I still love them. Okay, and the reason is because they have good space filling properties and they have good marginal coverage. Okay, so we know that not every one of those 28 parameters is going to be leading or doing anything to the CCN, monthly mean CCN, in a single grid box. Not all 28 parameters are going to affect that. Okay, there'll be a subset of those parameters that do. We just don't know what they are, and they might change between grid box. So the marginal coverage is really important for that. We're still getting a good design whichever grid box we're looking at and whichever the parameters are active. And it's got good space filling properties. I don't know anything about this, what's this uncertainty space at the moment. No one's ever really pushed the model beyond a best run, or a very simple 2 times something run. So I want to really look everywhere, or push it as far as the experts are willing to go. The number of runs, I looked at the rule of thumb. We did 10 times P runs. Actually, we got the first set of runs wrong, so we did some tests on how many we needed, and we did 6 times P runs in the end. And I'll show you later that actually that was too many as well. And then we sort of did a validation set. Now initially I chose to follow the Bastos-O'Hagan recommendation of having some close to the points we have and some far away. But that really was too many. We didn't really want the ones that were close to the points already. We don't validate sort of that stringently. So we now just do a sort of augmented Latin hypercube and check in the spaces. That's all we really care about. This is Latin hypercube. So the point is that if in 3 dimensions these black points are the ones that I use, if only one dimension is active, I've still got good coverage of that dimension. So the sort of red, black, blue, and green points show that. So that's what's really important for me for a Latin hypercube. So in the end, what we've got 168 runs of our global aerosol model. We have another 84 to validate it, which now I think back seems crazy to have half the number of runs just for validation. But had it not worked, we'd have had plenty of runs to still build a better emulator and validate it. But we could have used fewer runs here. And that is really important when you start to get other aerosol modelers to do this, because these runs are really not easy to do, these simulator runs. So this is just what a page of output kind of looks like, and what's hidden behind that are massive, massive files. So I've used a Gaussian process emulator here. So I'm building an emulator for the monthly mean CCN in a single grid box with respect to 28 uncertain parameters using 168 simulations. I'm not going to go into this bit because other people have. It requires a smooth output, but given the output is such a simple diagnostic from the model, that's really not an unreasonable output. And it's funny sort of what the scientists pick up on here, because they all said, oh, smooth, I don't think it should be smooth. But if it's not smooth, if they're just going to do a single model run and make inferences from that single model run, and they don't believe the smoothness of the output, then they've really no business making that inference. So it was quite easy to get them to agree with that assumption. Just for clarity, my mean function is this linear function at the bottom, and I use the Matern covariance. The Gaussian covariance didn't always work; it was a bit too smooth. But the Matern it seems to work a bit better. That's all. So for the emulator validation, this is one of the things I really struggle with, is to have a number which validates my emulator to say yes, it's right, use it. especially given I have 8,000 emulators over 12 months. So Bastos and O'Hagan, that's a really nice paper and it summarises some really good validation techniques, but you can't do it in 8,000 times 12 emulators. It's just not practical. So all I did was, one, check the prediction value was close to the simulator value, and then two, check the uncertainty on it was small enough that it wasn't sort of, right, I'm going to draw it. I've lost my chalk. So if I have this, okay, so I'm going to check that these lines cross this one-to-one line. This is my simulator, this is my emulator, and I'm going to check that they don't just do it because they're that big. Okay, so yeah, I've got two measures. One's measuring the size of the line, and one's checking that it's crossing that XY line. Oh, I put that plot in there anyway. Okay, and I'm also going to check that the size of these lines on average is small compared to the whole range covered. Okay, so the emulator uncertainty is small compared to the parametric uncertainty. So these are two of the plots here. This one here is showing that basically almost everywhere, over 90% of those points are crossing the XY line, the emulator and their uncertainty. In these spaces here where it's a bit low, it's simply because I can go in and check, it's simply because the emulator is very, very, very confident and the points are actually just right by the XY line. It's just their uncertainty doesn't cross. Okay, so all it's saying is my emulator is so confident there's not enough uncertainty on it. But for my purposes, that's fine. That's fine as long as it's close to the simulator. And in here, it's just showing that almost everywhere, less than 10%. The emulator uncertainty is less than 10% of the parametric uncertainty. So it's almost noise compared to the parametric uncertainty that I'm targeting. So if I look at emulator means in every single grid box, so these are 8,000 different emulators. I've taken the mean over that uncertainty space and plotted it here. And you can see that all the spatial structure is still there, despite the fact that I've done this all independently. And it looks exactly what they would expect, okay? So it's sort of showing me that this isn't crazy. And it's sort of showing the modelers that even when they push their model beyond what they are comfortable doing in normal terms, that they're still getting the same sort of output. So it's almost validating the simulator as well here. The difference being now is that I get these PDFs as well. There's nothing exciting about the sort of uncertainty in the uncertainty magnitude in these plots. The uncertainty magnitude is big where CCN is large, it's small where CCN is small. Okay. What we want is the sensitivity, what is leading to the uncertainty here in these. So we've got these PDFs, which they hadn't had before, but they're not that interesting really. What is interesting is when we do the sensitivity analysis on it. I'm only going to show plots of the main effect. The reason for that should be obvious. There really isn't much interaction. To do it, I've used the FAST99 sensitivity. It sort of couples really nicely onto the Dice-Kriegan package that I used. So I've emulated using Dice-Kriegan, run this FAST99 with it, taken just the main effect indexes from that for every single parameter. And then I map those. So what we can see here is the spatial structure is evident in those main effects as well. So over the oceans in this equatorial band, one parameter is dominating the uncertainty. One process is dominating the uncertainty in CCN. So over biomass burning regions, the diameter at which we emit the biomass burning particles is very important. That was an interesting result because the size at which we emit particles is more important than the actual rate at which we emit the particles. So when we go out and measure these particles, we should be trying to get the size of them right, or we should obviously be trying to get the size and the rate right. But it's most important that we learn how to measure the size of these particles right if we're going to reduce our uncertainty in CCN in this modelling world. If we look at this over time, so as I said, I've got these for every month, so these are independent emulators and analysis over every month as well. And you can see this temporal structure to these two, the seasonality. And it all makes sense. If you put these in front of the scientists, they can understand it. It all makes sense. So again, we're sort of validating the model, even within all this uncertainty space. The model's doing sensible things. So, as I said sort of at the start, for understanding, I think we're actually overcomplicating everything. On the left here, I've sampled randomly 90 runs from those 168, and quantitatively, which is really what's important for these results, they're the same. There's very little difference between what we found when we use 90 runs to when we use 168 runs. So 10 times P is a good starting rule, but if you actually read the paper that it comes from, they do have one line that says an alternative strategy might be to do 10 times D0, where D0 is the active dimensions. Okay, and when you have 28 parameters, it's very unlikely you have 28 active dimensions. So if you can, in some way, think about what active dimensions you have, it's 10 times that you should be doing. Okay. So as you can kind of, I guess, quantitatively tell from this, you probably can't see more than 9 colours there, so 90 seems a reasonable number. If I take it down to 50, all of these plots look the same and it all just looks like noise. Okay, so you can go too far, but 10 times P isn't really necessary. And with these sorts of models and working with different global modelling groups, it's really important that we try and make this efficient as possible. So 10 times P is too many, and it certainly doesn't scale with the number of parameters. So I'm going to also just mention the dimension reduction using this sensitivity analysis. So the common dimension reduction takes your ensemble and then does a PCA over that or something. Okay, but that isn't really considering the processes behind that are happening in the model. Whereas if we use a sensitivity analysis, we can dimension reduce, including the processes which are important to the uncertainty. So I've sort of done just k-means clustering of these main effect values, chosen 11 clusters, and I just did that by looking at different numbers of clusters and working out what I thought was best. But you start to find regions where the model behaviour is similar. So not the CCN is similar. I'm not that interested in regions where the magnitude of CCN is similar. What I'm interested in is where the model behaviour is similar. So you get that from this. And that's kind of important because you can see how constraining with these few observations affect what you get and how much you can actually do with an observation. So if I take, basically I've taken all of this data that went into making these plots for every single model grid box for all months and come up with these clusters. So each cluster has a similar sort of set of bar charts like this. This is the mean bar chart produced from the cluster means. You can see that over the marine regions, they all look pretty similar. You can tell that they're split up by this seasonality pattern in the biomass burning. Over the Arctic, they all kind of look like this. And and then you've got the biomass burning regions. Okay, so we can split the world up into these clusters that are representing what's happening within the model, which is important for the uncertainty. And one of the nice things was when I showed them this, given that this is all emulation sensitivity and I don't actually have any sort of scientific process in this, understanding in this, was that they could just see this and give them names relating to the aerosol that's going on. So you can even see this sort of like main dominant track across the Atlantic there. So, as I've said, one of the things I'm looking at now is trying to make this as efficient as possible to do with global, different global modelling groups. So, this two plots. This one on the left here is from emulation and sensitivity analysis. Running all this took, I don't know, about a week, possibly a bit longer, maybe even. And this here is done by using a method that Jeremy Oakley and Mark Strong have been sort of writing papers about, where they're using a generalised additive model only to get these main effects. Okay, they're not trying to do anything else which you could do with an emulator. They're only looking at these sensitivity analysis, and they're kind of similar. And if we look at the clusters in particular, they're almost the same. Okay, so what I need to do now is talk to the scientists and try and understand how they're going to use this information. So to do this generalised additive model, the whole thing took less than half a day, even writing the sort of code to do it. So if that's the main plot that they're getting out of this, then perhaps I'm already overcomplicating what I'm doing. And then I also just wanted to talk about using these sensitivity values for model constraint. So I think sensitivity analysis we've shown is just really powerful tool, and it gives the modelers sort of a really good handle on what's going on in their model. But I think for constraint it's almost been even more powerful. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a synthetic observation here. My red line is my synthetic observation. I'm going to say anything that doesn't fall within a certain tolerance of that observation, I'm going to get rid of. So I only have CCN values now that lie within that small range. And I'm only going to keep the parameter sets associated with those CCN values. Now if I do that, so my observation has come from here, it's basically the median model run in this grid box. And then I'm going to take those parameter sets that are left over. I'm going to run them in every other model emulator in that grid, and I'm going to see how much I've reduced the space. So 1 here means that I've almost completely reduced the space, and 0 means it's basically had no effect on the uncertainty on CCN. And as you can see, over all the marine regions, basically it's reduced CCN a lot, and over land it hasn't done anything. And that's because the parameter sets that I'm using here, all their active dimensions are reduced, but the active dimensions over land have not been reduced at all. So how does this, just trying to relate this back to the sensitivity analysis, the black dots mean that parameter set is left over. So in that top left plot, neither of those parameters showed any sensitivity to CCN. So all the black dots cover the whole region of that. In this top right plot, the parameter on the y-axis showed some sensitivity, the parameter on the x-axis showed none. So we've reduced that space, and marginally you could say we've reduced the range of that parameter. And similarly down here, this is a more sensitive parameter. But when you consider 2 sensitive parameters, so we've always got more than 1 sensitive parameter. Marginally we haven't really reduced the space at all, but we have reduced them in terms of this relationship. So looking at one-dimensional projections of parameter space when you've constrained is a really bad idea. That's basically all I wanted to show here. This is the same plot as I showed before. Just wanted to point out that you can match these up to the clusters. You can see sort of where the clusters were very similar and where they're not. Here I've taken the observation in a biomass burning region, and you can see that my CCN is reduced in all biomass burning regions. Whether it's reduced correctly, I can't be sure. So my CCN might be wrong now over Australia. But what I can say is that I know that I should look over Australia and check it. Okay? But there's no point me getting an observation to validate this constraint over the Arctic or the Antarctic. It's not going to tell me anything. And then sort of my final main point here, I guess, is I talked about aerosol cloud forcing, which is unobservable. But these CCN, you can imagine, they are affecting the clouds, therefore you'd expect the aerosol cloud interaction forcing to be dominated by what's happening to the CCN. But we live in the model world, not the real world, and we see that that doesn't happen. So whatever parameters and processes are dominating the CCN uncertainty in this model world are not the same as the parameters dominating the forcing uncertainty. So we can keep collecting CCN measurement observations, and this is synthetic, but there's no reason why. I mean, it's going to be true. This is idealized. It's going to be true for real observations for sure. But we can keep getting those observations, but that bar on that first plot that I showed you is not going to go down. We need to find a different observation. So if we collect CCN values over the polluted region, we do a slightly better job, but we're still not really, it doesn't in the model world have the same relationship we expect it to. And this is just a plot to show we can keep improving our constraint on CCN and make the model CCN better, reduce the uncertainty on it, but that aerosol forcing bar isn't going down like as we might hope. And it's because of something called equifinality, because the processes are different. So at the top we've constrained our CCN to that black region. The red and yellow values underneath are the surface of the CCN. And then on the right hand side, the red to yellow is the surface of the forcing. And you can see that those black points just cross the whole range still. And then the same here. So we've constrained our CCN to this sort of 600 value. We still cross the entire range of forcing. So these are real model results. I haven't sort of concocted this to prove a point. These are real model results. One of the problems is that these things are probably going to occur in real life, and some of them are artifacts of the model. And it's not obvious to me how we identify which of those is true, or whether we have to accept this as an irreducible uncertainty. One thing that we can do is try and use structural uncertainty to tell us more about this. So if these relationships are different in different models, maybe we can try and drill down and find, a common parameter set that works across all models that might reduce our uncertainty. Just a quick note on what happens when you start doing this in multiple models. So these are two chemistry models. Ed talked about these yesterday. I did a scoping study with 8 parameters here in the two models. They have exactly the same design. Both modelers went off and did it. This is one of the outputs. I can't remember, a tropospheric ozone burden. And you see both models give roughly the same answer from these same parameter sets. You can see its sensitivity says that roughly the same things going on between these two models. Basically, both models are simulating very similarly to give you the same answer. If you look at the maps, they're very similar too, so spatially they're doing the same thing. With the same set of runs, but a different model output, so this is methane chemical lifetime, they hardly overlap at all. The processes that are leading to those methane chemical lifetimes are totally different between the two models. Given the same runs that we did throughout. And the spatial fields are totally different too. So what we don't know is whether one of these is right or wrong. What we may be able to find out is whether they agree somewhere and whether we can reduce the uncertainty that way. Now I'm just going to mention scenarios before I stop. They're incredibly complicated. So the scenarios that went into that I think were concentration pathways, and now they've made them more complicated by including people in them. How you sort of understand what's gone into them, how you understand which bits of what's gone into them leading to those different ranges, I don't know. They can't be represented probabilistically. There's absolutely no way we can make enough of these scenarios to cover everything that might happen in the future. So firstly, we kind of have to just accept that this is given one scenario, this is what happens. Given another scenario, this is what happens. We can't merge those into a probabilistic framework. But what we want to know is whether we could use the emulation and the sampling to get a handle on if we can use those emissions and sample through those emissions, whether we can get a handle on what might happen as we raise the emissions and do it very simplistically. So we're going to give that a shot next and see whether we can relate that to these scenarios. That's it.
Questions?
Yeah, when you did your global sensitivity analysis, I think you made the assumption that the parameters are independent.
We did, so
Is
yeah.
there a reason to justify it? Because that's one of those tricky things that everybody does, and yet if they're correlated, you can get the wrong answers.
Yeah, so they're independent in the prior sense, so there's no reason that you can't have any value of one parameter given. Any value of one parameter doesn't affect what you have for another parameter. And the model run will still happen. Okay, so there's no sort of prior independence here. When it comes to the constraint, they're clearly not independent.
I guess what I was asking is, when you interpret your Sobel indices, you can get misleading interpretations with that representation, if they're correlated.
I don't think there's any reason to assume that these ones are correlated.
Why don't we talk about that one afterwards? Because that's
Yeah.
one of these, you're doing exactly what we did up until recently and everybody does.
Yeah.
Yet, like that example I showed yesterday, if they're correlated, you can have more influential parameters that are being absorbed through the correlation.
If I was to do this after the constraint, then definitely it wouldn't work. But I can't see. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Now, that's a topic for coffee later. Absolutely.
Yes. Another question on the interface between GP and sensitivity analysis.
Yeah.
There's been quite some work in the last few years on tuning a kernel or finding covariance kernels adapted for sensitivity analysis and also for propagating the uncertainty of the GP and to the sensitivity analysis Sobel indices estimation. And this is also connected to generalized additive models.
Okay.
In the sense that you have kernels that are additive
Yeah.
and that reflect this prior of additivity, and you have also kernels that make it simple to calculate the Sobel indices analytically and also to propagate uncertainty. So did you try this?
The only thing I did was really, one was just rerun it because the estimation changes, and rerun it and see what happens, and everything was fine. And really, yeah, I just sort of changed some of the assumptions. I didn't do any kind of higher level stuff than that really. But basically every time I run it, no matter what I do, as long as I've got enough runs, the same things come out. But I mean, if there's something else I can check, then that would be.
Well, that could probably make this simpler and also could enable working with less points.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Okay.
Propagating uncertainties when you have less productivity.
Okay. Yeah, so if you could formalize that, and that would be great.
Question about this, the rule of thumb that you
Yeah.
need 10 times more runs for to develop your emulator than you have in certain inputs. What do you think about how it works when you want to just do one collection of runs and develop multiple emulators for multiple different outputs? So
Yeah, so
do you then
that's
at some
what
point-
I've done.
Yeah, so how does it then scale up? So you have multiple different outputs that you want to make, each individual can be scaled up, you want to make emulators for all of them. Do you then, for 2, go from 6 to 8, that you need 8? How does it work?
I'm not sure I'm understanding. Essentially, what I've got are the same simulations
Yes.
for every single output that I do.
But, so my question is that you were able to go to say that 10 was more than needed, 6
Yeah.
was okay,
Yeah.
and so for your cloud conversation API emulator that was 6 was fine. But if you want to use the same set of runs also for lots of different outputs, I suppose at some point, for some output variables that you try to make emulators for, you need different combinations of parameters just because there's some interesting dynamics that would not have been covered in your initial set of 6 times your input.
Yeah.
So it should be more if you have more emulators in mind, more output variables in mind. I just wondered how that would increase.
I don't really know. I've never seen that happen actually. I think because of the Latin hypercube I've used, if it's a different set, as long as it's in my original design, it doesn't matter. If it's a different subset, if it's something totally different, then I'd hope that the design that I started off, because it's the maximum Latin hypercube, I'd get some information on where to put new points. But no, I haven't seen an output yet that behaves like that. If I did something more complicated, because I've broken it down into this monthly mean grid box value, it's quite a simple value, then maybe I would, but I haven't seen it yet. We're now working on a sort of more complicated model in that there's some noise associated with it, and I don't know how that's really working yet and how that's going to scale up. But then 10 times p might not be enough. But that's not related to the parameter then, that's related to the noise.
I actually have been I can play the stupid mathematician because I've been trying to keep on track, but this is sort of been answering my question. So can I just rephrase? So you've got 28 parameters and your outputs are grid point averages.
Yeah.
So essentially you want to predict several output points. Essentially everywhere around the globe you've got output values over the grid point values. So essentially you're trying to emulate everything with one set of experiments, basically.
Yes.
So that means if you've got something in the ocean where one parameter is essentially inactive, then you're doing a 28-dimensional problem where you could get away with a one-dimensional one or something like that. So I mean, my question comes towards you could tune if you were focusing on a region. You could tune your hypercube or whatever QMC design you're going to use to do much smaller dimensional and have much more points that are worth it. I mean, have any value for that particular grid point. Is that correct?
You could do that, yeah. I mean, the problem is like we kind of, with these models, have to do one-shot designs and get as much as we can out of that. So if we were to focus on a particular region and design to there, we'd perhaps only end up with simulations good for that, and you wouldn't. And if
you have this global view, I guess again you could take an average over all grid points as your quality measure.
Yeah.
Is there a ranking of your parameters of which are more important and less important? Because in essence, you could then still do better designs that are taking into account that. For example, I'm quite curious about what Henry Wynn said as well. That in integration where I've worked on quasi Monte Carlo, you would tune your lattice rules, your QMC designs to be more. They're better distributed along the first few dimensions than they are along the last ones, because the last parameters say are not very important. Is there any ranking like that, or is there none in your opinion?
Not for the design, because we don't have that information before we've done the analysis, and need the analysis.
But now you've done it, so now you could retrospectively improve your designs and use information from them.
We could.
But there's extensible lattice rules as well that learn.
Yeah, I mean, if there was interest in doing that, then we could do that. But I mean, the scientific questions can be answered from what we've got. So yeah, they wouldn't do those simulations for me to play with making it better.
You mentioned that you clustered some regions that show very similar, say, sensitivity patterns.
Yeah.
What is similar?
The main effects through that time series, so those bar charts that I showed, they will look the same in every grid box in those. So the processes that lead to the uncertainties in that CCN will be the same in each of those clusters.
And same means identical? Or?
Same means more similar than in the other clusters. Similar enough. I mean, so the first set of bar charts that I showed looked like the means, and even like in 3 clusters they looked kind of similar. So similar enough quantitatively for the modellers to see what the difference was between the clusters. So the ocean ones all looked very similar, except you could see a biomass burning seasonality in 2 of them that changed. So quantitatively, the processes were understandable to the scientists, basically. Yeah. If we reduce CCN uncertainty in one, we know the parameter set. We know where that will affect the parameter sets everywhere else, and where it won't, and that's the important information.
More questions? No? Then let's thank Lindsay again.